George Washington's daring attack on Trenton on Christmas Day in 1776 is famous in American history. But that attack might not have been as successful as it was if not for a small town in New Jersey and the brave militia who battled around it. I learned about the Battle of Ironworks Hill. Since 2026 is America's 250th birthday, I want to do some Revolutionary War topics. There's obviously a lot of big and vital moments for the Revolutionary War, but I want to start with something a bit different. I wasn't looking for a big battle or a big moment. I was looking for something smaller, more intimate. And I figured let me look at New Jersey, since it's an area from which I'm familiar. Plus, considering New Jersey's location, it's not shocking I would have some options. What I decided to go with is the Battle of Ironworks Hill, which had everything I wanted. It was a series of small skirmishes that had a bigger impact than I think it's generally credited for. It played a role in Washington crossing the Delaware. It shows the heroics of the men of the Revolution. It shows how the Revolution wasn't just a series of big set battles. Rather, it featured small skirmishes that were fought throughout the colonies. It shows how whole communities were overtaken by the Revolution, how the Revolution impacted daily life. Because in the end, this story is more than just a battle. This story showcases how the Revolutionary War was impacting people in their lives. And I think that's important to talk about. America, for the most part, has fought its wars abroad. So we don't see how it impacts daily life. Obviously, there's moments with like World War II where there was rationing and the industry kicked up to support the war. Both things clearly affected daily life. But still, the conflict was far away. I think if you walk through a city, it wouldn't feel like the war was about to be on your doorstep. At least that's how I interpret it. Of course, if people from that time are watching this, well, wow. But you could tell me I'm wrong. I'm good with it. I end up being wrong about a lot of things. The revolution was different. To be fair, the Civil War was too, especially down south. But we're here talking about the revolution. It's the 250th, guys. I think the revolution gets overlooked a little bit sometimes, as weird as that sounds. I know Ken Burns just had the great documentary out on it, but I still feel like people overlook it. I don't know, just happens for whatever reason. They're more enthralled by the Civil War than the Revolution, at least at this point in time. I wonder if you trace interest over the years, does it ebb and flow? Probably, but right now it seems like the Civil War would be more popular than the Revolution. None of this is really relevant to our topic, but I still find it interesting. Today is about the Battle of Ironworks Hill, a small series of battles in Mount Holly, New Jersey, that took place between December 22nd and December 23rd, 1776. Now, if you're sitting there going, December 22nd, December 23rd, that must mean something because Washington crossed the Delaware 2 days later on the 25th and attacked the British, well, technically Hessian troops. If you said that, you'd have a good point, and that's why this battle ends up mattering. The Battle of Ironworks Hill was fought in Mount Holly, New Jersey, which is south of Trenton. The whole point of it was to draw Hessian troops down south and keep them down south, away from the Washington and his people. That was why they did it. That's a simple explanation of what happened. Now, those who talk about this battle and hype it up, their claim is that drawing the troops away from Trenton gave Washington the ability to succeed. I'll get into this claim in a little bit, but that's why this battle can be considered notable, at least to historians. Now I'm trying to make it notable to you. Before getting into the battle, let's figure out what Mount Holly was like at the time. Well, at the start of the Revolution, Mount Holly sat as a town mixed with loyalists, patriots, and pacifists. The pacifists being the Quakers. I talked about them in other episodes. They were notorious pacifists, and the Revolution was not great for them. It was close to the central hub of the Revolution, Philadelphia. Google tells me it's a 2 hour bike ride, but I'm not sure how well that converts to horse. While it was close, it also seemed far enough away that people believed it wouldn't be kept out of the conflict, wouldn't play a major role. Those people were wrong. Mount Holly had an inauspicious start to its revolutionary history. On December 12, 1776, colonial forces arrested Dr. Daniel Bancroft in Mount Holly for being a spy. In his appeal to the Continental Congress, Bancroft tells a tale of being forced to sign an oath by the Hessians. The oath stated that he would not take up arms in the present war. Bancroft argued that he did this for personal safety, and he was not against the liberty of America. He was released in April of 1777, and he went on to become a surgeon for the Loyalist forces. Now, obviously, as I read that, I was like, well, there you go. Maybe they were right. The guy leaves colonial hands, and he immediately becomes a surgeon for the Loyalist forces. But I don't know enough about him. Maybe he was just a loyalist. Boo. But I could see a world in which you could make an argument of like, well, he was just held in jail by the colonial powers for months after being forced to take an oath by the Hessians. That could turn him against the colonists. Also, it could have been the only option after he had his arrest. Maybe nowhere else would hire him. That's Mount Holly leading into December 1776, binding traitors. So, what's going on with the war? Well, George Washington had just suffered his major defeats in New York, climaxing with the losses at Fort Washington and Lee in November of 1776. Washington found himself chased through New Jersey by General Cornwallis. The outlook was looking bleak for the American forces at this time. When I look at George Washington as a general, I realize his greatest strength was his ability to maintain his army, keep them in the fight when they should not be able to keep going. When they have lost and they're on retreat, somehow his army stays together, stays cohesive. That really was his skill. I don't know if I would take him for my battlefield command, but outside of it, definitely I would take him. So it's December 1776, and Washington is on the run from Cornwallis. Washington realizes his army is in bad shape, morale is low. They have to do something. They need to make a move. They need to get the momentum back. And that's why he planned his raid on Trenton. After spying on the Hessian troops in Trenton, Washington planned to lead 2,400 men across the Delaware River to attack 15 or so Hessian soldiers, led by Colonel Johann. Washington did request reinforcements, but due to weather issues, they were unable to meet up with him. Washington made the call that he couldn't wait and decided to attack Trenton on Christmas night, December 25th, 1776. Washington was aware that there were an additional 2,000 Hessian soldiers down in South Jersey under Colonel von Donop. In Washington's mind, von Donop's troops had to stay in South Jersey. George Washington turned to Colonel Samuel Griffith to lead a force of about 600 men against von Donop. The sole goal was to keep von Donop's forces far enough below Trenton so as to be unable to render aid to Colonel Rahl. Simple plan. Occupy them. Keep them busy. Kind of like what you do with a kid. Give him a toy so he leaves you alone. I'm not a parent, guys. Griffin's goal was not to go out there and wipe out von Donop's forces. His plan wasn't to win this great colonial victory. His goal was to distract, keep them busy. Every day that they had to stay down in Mount Holly is a day that they couldn't go to Trenton and hurt Washington. This makes perfect sense to me in my brain. So, Griffin developed a pretty simple strategy: attack, retreat. They would attack at select locations in Mount Holly, like Petticoat Bridge. They'd fire a few volleys and fall back quickly. Griffin had his men set up a fortification on a hill by an ironworks, hence the name of the battle. Griffin's men used this hill as a fallback position after they attacked von Donop's forces in other areas. They did also eventually abandon this hill as they stood no chance of holding it. Now, to be honest, there are not a lot of sources regarding these clashes. The Battle of Ironworks Hill has, generally speaking, been overlooked for most of history. So you won't find great historical works written about it, but there are sources. For example, Griffin's plans recorded in the journal of Joseph Reed, who served as adjunct general to the Continental Army. Reed notes that Griffin's forces would have been unable to render any service beyond drawing the attention of the Hessian forces. They were not going to be able to go help Washington. They weren't there for the great big battle. Now, as I just said, there's not great histories written about it, and first-person accounts are also limited, at least from what I can find. Okay, guys, I'm doing this for my short history videos. I'm not able to take the time I need to go research and see if I can find more first-person accounts, if they even exist. Stop attacking me. Seriously, let me alone, guys. Anyway, the best account is from Hessian Captain Johann Ewald. His journals report on numerous skirmishes that occurred on those 2 days in December. He describes how the colonial militia would strike and retreat, strike and retreat. It's clear they had a plan, and they stuck to it. Ewald's journals are also helpful because they show the Hessian perspective. And by all accounts, in this journal, the Hessians were staying down in Mount Holly because of these attacks. Fun little fact, the journal even records the reception of the news that Washington had attacked Trenton. Ewald wasn't thrilled. The only real accounts of the skirmishes from the colonial side comes from the journal of George Ewing. George Ewing was a soldier in the New Jersey militia. He served at Brandywine in Germantown, and he spent the winter at Valley Forge, so he froze his butt off. His journal reports several days of clashes with both militia advances and retreats. He isn't overly detailed in his reporting of these battles. However, to be fair to Mr. Ewing, he wasn't writing his journal for historians to look at later. He was just writing about his life. You might get annoyed by hearing me keep saying there's a lack of sources, but if you're curious why I'm going on about it, well, you'll see in the sources section of my episode description that there are only a couple things written about the battle. A section of a book here, an article there. I know American Battlefield Trust has something on their website. This isn't like the Battle of, say, Yorktown, where you can find all these wonderful histories. There's just not a lot for Ironworks Hill, so a lot of the details come from these primary sources, of which there are few. I'm also kind of, in a weird way, giving you a little bit of an idea of how historians have pieced things together. They look at information from all over to develop a story. That's how you do it. It's like a puzzle. You're putting all the pieces together. Very rarely are historians lucky enough to have one source that spells everything out, but even if they do have such a wonderful item, they need other sources to confirm the details. You can't just trust one source alone. Luckily, there are some documents from citizens who were in the area at the time. They help at least fill out the story a little bit. For example, John Hunt was a local Quaker living in Morristown, a neighboring town in Mount Holly. Hunt reported in his journal about the days leading up to the skirmish. He states that on the 15th of December, the town is concerned about the British moving in and that the residents may try to hide. Again, I talked about how this is more than just the battle, but how it affects daily life. He continues journaling and mentions a series of skirmishes between the colonial and Hessian forces on the 22nd of December. He knows that these skirmishes ended with the Americans retreating and the Hessians remaining in Mount Holly. There's not a lot there, but it is another confirmation of what was happening. Then there's Margaret Morris's Revolutionary Journal. And truthfully, that's one of the most well-known documents from that time, at least from South Jersey. It's pretty popular. Morris was a woman living in the area who wrote down everything, and it's really cool to read and fairly helpful. She covers the days leading up to the skirmishes, giving the readers insights into the fear and anxiety overtaking the region. And again, that's something that I stress is different about the Revolution versus later wars like World War II. Yes, there's plenty of fear and anxiety when we go to war somewhere else. When it could be arriving at your doorstep, that's a different level of fear. She does talk about Hessians routing colonial troops at Mount Holly. Maybe I shouldn't say routing because that was the colonial militia's plan. They knew they'd lose. They were out there to delay, delay, delay. That was their goal. So maybe they did win. You know what? I'm counting it. Score one for Griffin's men. I will also point out Margaret uses the term we when referring to colonial forces. She uses the term we to show her allegiance. So that's kind of neat. She clearly supported the colonial side. In all honesty, her account is the least accurate in terms of the battle. That wasn't her expertise. She wasn't involved in the fighting. But her journal is maybe one of the best resources for people who want to understand what was happening at the time. There were some newspaper accounts for the battles. The Pennsylvania Evening Post reported on December 24th that the conflicts occurred and notes that Colonel Griffin led the colonial militia. It even gives the casualty reports for the colonial militia of 2 killed and 7 or 8 wounded. It did also say that the British, aka the Hessians, had several killed and wounded as well. It is awesome that the newspaper includes some casualty figures. It's information historians want. I don't know about you, maybe it's just me and my weird brain, but after studying history more and really delving into it, I've gained a far greater appreciation for newspapers. Also, I've been shocked how far back newspapers were a thing. You think about it, and yes, I knew there's pamphlets like Common Sense, but I don't know why I was just thinking pamphlets. Newspapers just never crossed my mind. Granted, I wouldn't call it the same type of newspaper we necessarily get today. Well, definitely not. We have the internet. But I would say it's still fascinating that these papers were out there. But that could just be me. Finally, there is Robert Morris, who somebody did an episode on. Not going to say who. Okay, it was me. He was a congressional delegate who wrote to John Hancock about Washington's Trenton Plan. As part of his letter, Morris covers the battles of Mount Holly. He explains to Hancock that the plan was to have Griffin's militia forces draw the Hessians away from Trenton. I always find it interesting that the letter was dated December 26th, the day after the Trenton battle, but between slower mail, passing information, I can take that into account that he was relaying this after. Maybe he just wanted to seem like he was in the know, pretending he knew before he heard about it. The Battle of Trenton obviously was a great success for American forces. It provided a much needed morale boost to an army on its heels. So, did the skirmishes in and around Mount Holly help the battle? Unfortunately, there's no definitive yes. You don't have Washington writing in his memoirs crediting these skirmishes. No words from Washington stating, without those boys in Mount Holly, my goose would have been cooked. I feel like Washington would have used that phrase. There is a letter from Washington to Griffin on December 24th, where it doesn't mention the fights Griffin had just led his men into. The letter only covers some army issues. However, there is another letter dated December 27th from Washington to Hancock. Washington addresses his other generals' inability to bring troops to Trenton. In the letter, he writes, I am fully confident that could the troops under Generals Ewing and Cadwalder have passed the river, I should have been able, with their assistance, to drive the enemy from all their posts below Trenton. But the numbers I had with me being inferior to theirs below me, and a strong battalion of light infantry being at Princeton above me, I thought it most prudent to return the same evening with the prisoners and the artillery we had taken. In that letter, Washington is expressly saying that the size of the opposing forces helped dictate the battle. If Washington needed greater forces for greater success, I'm going to say it's likely that the Hessians having an additional 2,000 troops in Trenton would not have helped Washington. It possibly could have led to defeat or a more minor victory. Washington needed as few Hessians and threats as possible in order to win his victory. He was doing a surgical strike. All that is to say that logic would dictate that less troops up in Trenton is a good thing when Washington was worried about the size of the opposing forces, which means, yes, the skirmishes helped the Trenton raid. They really mattered. Who knows what would have happened if those additional 2,000 troops been in Trenton? The Mount Holly boys had G-Dub's back. I just really wanted to say G-Dub at some point. Now, that's pretty much a synopsis of what happened. Colonel Griffin's men kept the Hessians away with small battles. But here's where things get a little fun, a little interesting, a little salacious. There is a good chance that a citizen of Mount Holly played the most crucial role in the entire affair. In 1979, Johann von Ewald's journals were discovered. These are the journals I mentioned earlier that were so crucial in finding out what happened in those days. Real quick, think about that. They were found in 1979. How wild is that? It's crazy how history works, that 200 years after someone's journaled, their work can be found and used as primary sources. If you're wondering how that happens, think about your own life and your family, how documents are passed down from time to time, and no one either looks at them or they don't care about history. They are family documents, so they don't get thrown out, but they just sit in a box, maybe end up on Pawn Stars. That happens all the time, not just in families, but also in communities and institutions. So that's how something can go 200 years without being found. It's possible. That's why when I say there's not a lot of first person accounts here, but there may be later, it's not totally unrealistic. It's a matter of someone having the time, patience, and money to be able to go through all the documents out there and maybe find pieces that no one else has been paying attention to, either because they're relevant to other discussions or because no one knew they were important. Maybe they're connected to families and places that haven't been contacted yet. You don't know. I'm not saying that it will happen, just that it could. Also, to be fair, if historians aren't looking for specific mention of these battles, they could be passing over them in their research. Historians have limited time and resources, so they try to stick to their topic when looking at things. Anyway, sorry for that tangent. In these journals, Ewald states that von Donop decided to stay in Mount Holly because he had found in his quarters an exceedingly beautiful young widow of a doctor. In the most ironic twist of fate, historians Dennis Rizzo and Alicia McShulkis believe that the widow was the wife of Dr. Daniel Bancroft. You know, the spy I mentioned earlier? They put together a pretty strong case. They don't have a definitive proof, but they defend their position well. I know what you're thinking. Dr. Bancroft is alive, so his wife couldn't be a widow. Well, sure, he's alive, but he's in jail. So she can just claim herself a widow, especially when you have the Hessian forces there. It's just easier to say, hey, my husband's dead, than, hey, my husband's in jail for being a traitor, even though he was a traitor for their forces. Anyway, the theory is that von Donop stayed in Mount Holly even after Griffin pulled his troops because of her. Basically, von Donop could have made his way up the Trent, but he said, no, 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 this woman is beautiful. I must stay here. I almost did a German accent, but it was bad. That's just an incredible twist of fate. Von Donop finds love and loses the battle. Real quick, I do want to say that I think if von Donop had made a move to leave Mount Holly, it is likely Griffin would have attacked him again to keep him away from Trenton. But why would he attack von Donop if von Donop is willingly staying away from Trenton? The aftermath of the battle between the British and colonial forces would obviously take books and books to explain. They've been written. Instead, let me focus on the key players in the Battle of Ironworks Hill. Colonel Rahl, the commander of the Hessian troops in Trenton, was mortally wounded in the battle. He died on December 27th. George Washington, he did some stuff later on, I guess. Went on to lead the Revolution of Victory and then serve as our first president after the Constitution's ratification. I mean, I guess he did some things. You could say that. The leader of the Hessian forces in Mount Holly, Colonel von Donop, found love and continued to serve with the Hessians until he was killed in the Battle of Red Bank in 1777. I actually don't know how the romance played out. I assume it fizzled out after he had to leave. Colonel Samuel Griffith's story is a bit more unique in that he appears to just step out of the war after the battle, but I don't have a definitive why. There's no clear understanding. He wrote a letter to George Washington on January 30th, 1777, apologizing for his continued illness. That's probably some of the reason. Furthermore, a letter from Washington to Joseph Reed dated February 23rd, 1777, states that Griffin has turned down several promotions. I have read some theories. Obviously, there's an illness. Maybe he was just sick and couldn't fight. But others believe that Griffin wanted more recognition for his accomplishments, as was hinted at in the letter from Washington to Reed. Maybe he fell out because of that. Could be either thing or both. He did live until 1810. The Hessians pulled out of Mount Holly shortly after the Battle of Ironworks Hill. The British forces stayed away from Mount Holly until 1778. However, American forces were pretty much frequently around Mount Holly in those years. It happens. One moves out, one moves in, one out, one in. It's like Risk, where you lose and regain places all the time. One interesting final side note, in April of 1778, George Washington received notification of a court-martial occurring in Mount Holly. William Leeds was being accused of desertion. Furthermore, the colonial government exerted power in Mount Holly by holding the Court of Admiralty sessions there. These would typically take place in someone's home. Just a little bit of what was going on. The British did reoccupy Mount Holly in the beginning of June of 1778. They retreated into New Jersey after leaving Philadelphia. The British didn't stay long. They left by the end of June. As soon as they moved out, the Admiralty courts began again. Colonial forces did not waste time. Truthfully, none of this was really relevant to the topic, but I found it interesting, so I shared it. Give you a little idea what happened to Mount Holly after the battle. Part of me understands why the Battle of Ironworks Hill is forgotten about. It isn't the Battle of Monmouth. It isn't some huge set piece that you're going to see in a movie. The ones where you see the lines and lines of soldiers and the cannonballs firing. This was a series of skirmishes, but it played a critical role, at least in the opinion of several historians, and I kind of agree. They pulled 2,000 Hessians down from Trenton and forced them to stay away from Trenton at a critical time. The Battle of Trenton was a huge moment in American history, and the militia forces in Mount Holly played a part of it. Apparently, so did a widow, or the pretty wife of an arrested man, at least. So again, I think that makes Ironworks so important. That's all I have. Hopefully you like this episode. Please like, subscribe, tell your friends, do all that, and I'll be back with something else. Thank you.